tea, Mr. Holmes.
Is it poisoned, Nanny?
There's enough of that in you already.
I tell you the truth, I always thought that the character of the most famous detective in history was totally fictional. Like, we owe it to the writer genius of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the trick with this feeling that Sherlock Holmes was real. Well, he ought to be. His personality with all those numerous peculiarities is so convincing. So no wonder a whole universe, a fandom was built around his name already in his lifetime. Well, in the lifetime of Doyle, to be precise. There is even that famous flat in Baker Street 221B that really exists.
The name Sherlock Holmes and the address is 221B Baker Street.
Yet that was just wishful thinking of the fans of the detective series. There was no Sherlock or someone like him in reality. Well, that's what I thought until I sat reading and preparing my video about Sherlock Holmes actors. And in the course of preparation, I realized that there were actually a number of rather viable suggestions of who might be the rather close prototype to the consulting detective.
You're a bloody psychopath.
High-functioning sociopath. With your number.
I found that very interesting and decided to share it with you today.
My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems. Give me work.
The Scottish Arthur Conan Doyle explicitly said that his literary inspiration, not personal one, we'll come to that later, so the literary inspiration for Sherlock was taken from the fictional character of Le Chevalier C. Auguste Dupin, invented by the American Edgar Allan Poe in 1841. He sort of kickstarted this whole detective fiction mania that would win the reading public in the late Victorian and the Edwardian eras and keep its leading position throughout the 20th century with its golden age of detective fiction, and even now being fueled by super popular stage and screen adaptations.
Right, you're out.
Until next time, Big Joe.
Always a pleasure, Mr. Holmes.
Thank heaven you're here, Lestrade. I'd almost run out of jokes.
You know, in another life, you'd have made an excellent criminal.
Yes, and you, sir, an excellent policeman.
That Dupin wasn't just a sleuth. His thing was this combination of considerable intellect with creative imagination, sort of putting himself in the mind of a criminal. This alone sounds familiar already, isn't it?
Holmes, what are you doing?
Nothing.
Are you wearing a
False nose? No.
In addition, he also had a companion who is the unnamed narrator of the stories, a prototype of Watson to some extent. Interestingly, Doyle made several references to Poe's character in Sherlock stories. For example, in the first one, A Study in Scarlet from 1887, Dr. Watson compares Holmes to Dupin, to which Holmes replies, "No doubt you think you are complimenting me. In my opinion, Dupin was a very inferior fella. He had some analytical genius, no doubt, but he was by no means such a phenomenon as Poe appears to imagine."
What the hell are you doing?
Bored.
What?
Bored.
No.
Bored. Bored.
Funny, right? Holmes talks about Dupin as a fictional personage, as if he isn't himself.
What? What is it? What did I miss?
Well, it appears he wasn't that far from such an assumption. Just think of this. The name of Poe is bigger and certainly feels more real than the name of Dupin, while that of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, no matter how praised and noted he was, is shamefully standing in the shadow of his famous creation.
Ah, Watson. It's a wicked world. And when a clever man turns his brain to crime, it's the worst of all.
Unlike Agatha Christie with her Marple and Poirot, Doyle was certain and rather open about the origins of his Holmes. He insisted that his inspiration was some Joseph Bell, whom he met in 1887. Bell was a surgeon at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh and a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. Doyle was one of his students and later worked for him as a clerk. They said that Bell was famous for drawing broad conclusions from minute observations. In other words, he emphasized the importance of close observation in making a diagnosis.
Shut up, everybody! Shut up! Don't move, don't speak, don't breathe. I'm trying to think. Anderson, face the other way. You're putting me off. What? My face is?
Everybody quiet and still. Anderson, turn your back.
It's not your taxi.
Mrs. Hudson!
To illustrate this, he would often pick a stranger and by observing him, deduce his occupation and recent activities. These skills caused him to be considered a pioneer of forensic pathology at a time when science was not widely used in criminal investigations.
I said, focus.
It's all well and clever having a mind palace, but you've only 3 seconds of consciousness left to use it. So come on. What's going to kill you?
Blood loss.
Exactly.
Later in his career, he even helped Scotland Yard in their complicated investigations. So this particular trait fascinated Doyle, and he eagerly attributed it to his colleague. Amusingly, Bell was aware of this notion and, as a gentleman, didn't take this compliment for granted. Actually, he turned it back to Doyle and once wrote to him, "You are yourself a Sherlock Holmes, and well you know it." This sounds interesting, isn't it? Certainly both men knew each other very well, and we can rely on their proper judgments way more than our today's deductive conclusions.
You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
Your conversation really is most entertaining. If you would close the door. On your way out.
And still, do you believe that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself could be the person behind his famous detective? Let's see what they had in common. They were about the same age. Doyle was born in 1859 and Sherlock appears to be 5 years older, being born in 1854, as we learn in his last Bow story. Doyle was a physician by education and initial occupation, and Holmes was keen on chemistry, anatomy, perfectly knew the effects of various poisons. Both of them shared a keen interest and knowledge of botany. Arthur Conan Doyle loved solving crimes himself. The writer personally investigated 2 closed cases, which led to 2 men being exonerated of the crimes of which they were accused. Partially as a result of one of those cases, the English Court of Criminal Appeal was established in 1907. Moreover, in 1903, Doyle founded his own private social club, where they discussed crime and detection, criminals and criminology. Amazingly, this club is still functioning today. It is called Our Society. They meet 4 times a year and the membership numbers are limited to 100. The logo is, of course, the silhouette of Arthur Conan Doyle himself.
Madam, I need you to remain calm, and trust me, I'm a professional. But beneath this pillow lies the key to my release.
In terms of religion, the writer went from being Catholic to agnostic and then spiritual mystic, quite a fashionable inclinations in his time. When it comes to Sherlock, he appears to be skeptically sitting on the fence of any particular religion, often sharing some atheist thoughts. Much like his creator, isn't it? Yet, to be honest, it doesn't seem that Holmes cared much about religion at all.
That's why I find this modern religious fervor so troubling. There's no latitude for misunderstanding.
Faith runs right over reasons.
Indeed. And chambermaids were once such a liberal breed.
My wife's a chambermaid.
Arthur Conan Doyle was an avid sportsman, a football goalkeeper, a cricketer, a golfer, a skier, an amateur boxer. Could you imagine? He also was one of those 3 judges for the world's first major bodybuilding competition. Sherlock Holmes was also known for possessing above-average physical strength and being a fan of bare-knuckle boxing. He was undoubtedly one of the finest boxers of his weight that I have ever seen, says Watson. That's quite an unusual hobby for an intellectually consulting detective, in my opinion, and it brings the author and its character as close to each other as possible. Although Doyle certainly couldn't boast that particular strength and physical abilities, could it be that he deliberately enhanced these features in his detective alter ego?
First, distract target. Then block his blind jab. Counter with cross to left cheek. Discombobulate.
At the same time, they're so different when it comes to private matters. The portrait of Sherlock Holmes involves that certain level of asexuality, even despisal of womankind. The character of Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory would be a nice analogy here. No wonder Sherlock never married and never had any kids or relationships to which he would devote his mind.
Let's talk about murder. Sorry, did I say murder? I meant to say married.
On the opposite, Arthur Conan Doyle appeared to be happily married twice and had 5 kids in his 2 marriages. Interestingly, none of them had children of their own, Doyle's grandchildren, so the writer has no living descendants now.
Imagine someone's going to get murdered at a wedding. Who exactly would you pick?
I think you're a popular choice at the moment, dear.
By the way, one of Doyle's sons, Adrian, claimed that for Holmes, his father took the methods of Joseph Bell and his own personality. That's what Bell actually meant writing that letter to Doyle, stating that Sherlock was no one else than Sir Arthur himself.
Rache, German for revenge. She could be trying to tell us
Yes,
something.
thank you for your input.
Adrian Doyle reckoned that his father even explicitly admitted that at the very end of his life, when he knew he was dying. He gave one last interview to an American journalist in 1930 where he reportedly said, "I confess now that if anybody watched Sherlock Holmes, it was myself."
Now, Holmes was a puppet sitting on my father's knee. His ideas, his words, spoke through Holmes. And so it's really very difficult to differentiate one man from the other. They both belong to each other.
So, could we consider this case closed? Holmes is Doyle, or Bell, or both?
Did I really do remarkably badly?
Yes.
Have you not learned, my esteemed commentator, that the created is not the creator? This is another statement from Doyle himself, which he put into the form of the satirical 1912 poem to an undiscerning critic. So please grip this fact with your cerebral tentacle. The doll and its maker are never identical. Seems like Doyle from 1912 contradicts himself from 1930. What would you say? Do you have enough evidence to attribute the detective's personality to its author? Or is it more a combination of personal traits of 2 people, with a twist of complete invention?
We should call the police.
Yes.
On their way. For God's sake.
Shut up, it's quick.
I would even go further and suggest, and I'm not alone in this idea, that Doyle's alter ego could have been Watson, not Holmes. Watson is a very real person, like any one of us could be. No wonder that he's the narrator of the stories, inviting us to share all those adventures with the impeccably rational genius, who, thanks to the thorough observation of his companion, this Watson Doyle, becomes real.
What are you typing?
Blog.
About?
Us.
You mean me.
Why?
Well, you're typing a lot.
And who portrayed such complex personality of Sherlock at the best? We'll find out in my next video. Stay tuned.
Part 2. Part 2 is more action-based. I'm gonna walk around, shake things up a bit.
Oh, no, don't even begin. Just like there is a Sherlock Holmes fandom, there is a whole universe of his incarnations on screen. How can we even look through all those stunning actors and objectively rank their performances? Well, I can promise you it will be subjective and will certainly miss some of the portrayals, and you will curse me for this. Yet you'll still get a pretty good idea of how Sherlock Holmes' likeness evolved in movies and TV series for over a century. The character of the most famous British detective was invented by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle back in the late 1880s. Yes, I said invented, although there is a popular belief that he must have existed in reality. Even my recent poll in this channel's community proved this bias. No wonder that such popularity that almost brought the fictional character to life also brought up additional challenges to the actors who would portray Sherlock on screens.
You keep out of my stomach with your deductions, Mr. Holmes. Don't like it. Must have a little privacy.
Overall, there were 75 actors playing the part in over 250 productions. The character of Sherlock even holds the Guinness World Record for the most portrayed literally human character in film and television history.
However did you guess, Mr. Holmes?
Miss Smith, I never guess.
One last caveat, the video is going to focus on English-speaking portrayals of Sherlock. Obviously, there were other notable and extremely interesting takes on the character in other languages. Let me know if you would be interested to see such a selection.
Dear fellow, how are you, Holmes? I'm delighted to see you. Perfectly delighted, upon my word I am, but...
The earliest actor to assume the role was American William Gillett. By the way, he was also a founding member of the New York Holmes Society, still known as the Baker Street Irregulars. Gillett was a stage actor, yet his take is extremely important in the overall sequence of future portrayals, since he apparently added several crucial details to the character that were not invented by Doyle, yet were the liberal interpretations of his own. For example, it is thought that he was the originator of this "elementary, my dear Watson" phrase.
Elementary, my dear fellow, elementary.
Like really, one of the most quoted and iconic aspects of Sherlock's character has not been plotted by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, Holmes often calls his observations elementary and sometimes refers to his companion as "my dear Watson", yet the phrase "elementary, my dear Watson" is never uttered in any of the 60 stories by Doyle. Moreover, Gillett also influenced this detective look we immediately think of upon hearing his name today, like Sherlock's emblematic curved calabash pipe is not original to Conan Doyle's writings, yet it was introduced by William Gillett. This curved design was thought to have been fit for the actor's jaw during a long performance, so he could pronounce his lines more easily. Gillett also used the deerstalker hat, which was also unspecified in Doyle's narration, yet first appeared in some Strand illustrations by Sidney Paget. All in all, he was widely praised for his performance. Contemporaries described his acting as unemotional, dry and crisp, the traits that perfectly conveyed the presence of the famous detective. It looks like the writer quite liked his acting. On one occasion, after they have exchanged numerous telegrams about the play, Gillett telegraphed Doyle, "May I marry Holmes?" Doyle responded, "You may marry him, murder him, or do whatever you like with him."
Do you remember that you asked me a question just now? Well, this is the answer. I do care for you, I do.
In fact, in 1916 he also appeared in a silent film made out of the late 19th century stage play. The movie was thought to be lost until in 2014 they announced that a copy had been discovered in film archive in France.
Watson, my dear fellow, to change the subject a trifle.
For 2 years, from 1921 to 1923, another 47 silent black and white films were released by the British Stoll Pictures, featuring an English actor, Ale Norwood. These were mostly adaptations of original stories lasting about 20 minutes each. Until recent years, Norwood was the one who had played Holmes more times than any other actor in film or TV. His acting was also witnessed and appreciated by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who once reportedly said, "His wonderful impersonation of Holmes has amazed me." Well, must have been really huge to hear such words of admiration from the author himself. The public loved his work both on screen and on stage. Mr. Norwood not merely played Sherlock Holmes, he was Sherlock Holmes. Every trick, every mannerism of the immortal sleuth was there, so real, so natural that one wondered whether in private life the actor had a personality of his own. It was a great performance, as one reviewer said.
Sherlock Holmes, Esquire.
What is it? What is it?
In English, Clive Brook was another notable actor to take on the role of Holmes in the first spoken cinema film. Remember, I mentioned the elementary "My dear Watson" phrase that was compiled by Gillett? Well, it is believed that Brook was the one to actually say that in the movie.
Incredible, my dear Holmes, amazing. Elementary, my dear Watson. Elementary.
The first of the 3 episodes with Brook, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, was released by Paramount Pictures in 1929. As I've said, it was the first sound film to feature Sherlock Holmes. Curiously, they also produced a silent version of the picture to accommodate theaters that did not feature sound at that time. Ironically, the original voices were lost in the course of history.
Holmes, where on earth have you been? I've been trying to get you at the club, at Scotland Yard, all over London.
You were looking for me in the wrong places.
A South African-born English actor, Basil Rathbone, put on the deerstalker cap of Sherlock in 14 US films in 1939 and the early 1940s. His looks and acting were much in line with the notable works of his illustrious predecessors. Yet there was some rather daring novelty that would be heavily used in the screen adaptations in the 21st century. While the first 2 episodes produced by 20th Century Fox were traditional period pieces, the next 10 Universal Pictures films abandoned Victorian Britain and moved to the contemporary setting of the Second World War, in which Holmes occasionally battles Nazis. Amazing, right? It looks like the liberal screenplay with Benedict Cumberbatch. We'll get to him soon. Suddenly, isn't that groundbreaking, huh? Although when it comes to Universal Pictures from the 1940s, they apparently went for such alterations due to the restricted budget, which wouldn't allow large spending on period decorations. Just like many actors from the Sherlock Holmes canon, Rathbone became largely associated with his celebrated character and was unable to become free from his shadow, despite appearing in other film roles. A blessing and a curse at the same time, right?
And now I have a most regrettable task to perform.
Rathbone himself noted that his first picture was, as it were, a negative, from which I merely continued to produce endless positives of the same photograph. Yet the public and critics still loved him.
My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems. Give me work.
Jumping for 4 decades, and here we see a hilarious Jeremy Brett, who played the role of Sherlock for 10 years from 1984 to 1994. All in all, this English actor appeared in 41 episodes, although he also wasn't happy about becoming a typecast. Eventually this happened, and despite a long and fruitful career in cinema and on stage, Brett is commonly remembered as an iconic Sherlock Holmes. At least the actor didn't have to experience the downsides of such fame for long. He sadly died a year after they completed the production.
Your conversation really is most entertaining. If you would close the door. On your way out.
Holmes is the hardest part I have ever played, harder than Hamlet or Macbeth. Brad surely embraced this acting challenge and no doubt succeeded in delivering the character of the great detective. Just like William Gillett for the early 20th century and then Basil Rathbone for the 1940s, Brad became the definitive Sherlock Holmes for his epoch. Amusingly, before playing Sherlock, he was engaged as Dr. Watson in the 1980 Los Angeles production of The Crucifer on Blood. This coincidence made him one of only a small number of professional actors to play both Holmes and Watson in their careers.
You mentioned your name just now as if I should recognize it, but I can assure you, beyond the obvious facts, that you are a bachelor, a solicitor, and a Freemason, and an asthmatic. I know nothing about you whatever.
When Jeremy Brett accepted the offer of Granada Television, he set the bar as high as possible. He wanted to be the best Sherlock Holmes the world has ever seen. Just like David Suchet with his study of the character of Poirot. Yes, you may learn about it in this video here. Brett conducted extensive research on Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself, and was very attentive to discrepancies between the scripts he had been given and Doyle's original stories. Just like Suchet, he had his 77-page Baker Street file on everything from Holmes' mannerisms to his eating and drinking habits. He studied the nuances during the lunch breaks, on the weekends, and on his holidays.
But I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave mental exaltation.
Brad was really fascinated by the figure of Sherlock Holmes with his manias and obsessions. People say that the actor's character resembled Holmes' portrait, with those waves of energetic passion followed by lethargic silence. They say that Brad even started dreaming about Holmes, and his dreams turned into nightmares. To somehow distance him from the fictional image, Brad began to refer to Holmes as you-know-who.
That is why I've chosen my own profession, or rather, created it. For I am the only one in the world.
Well, although it took much from the actor's mental efforts, the result turned out to be spectacular. Would you agree?
Would you please join me in the call of fire? 1, 2, 3. Fire!
Fire!
We can do better than that.
Another milestone, in my opinion, would be Sherlock's incarnation by an American Robert Downey Jr. alongside Jude Law as Dr. Watson. Together they returned in the 2011 sequel Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, and the third film is expected to be released in the near future. Yet it was postponed many times for all these years, so who knows if it ever sees the light.
I agree, it's not my best disguise, but let's make do.
My God! The directorship of Guy Ritchie somewhat hints that the films were not going to be some traditional Victorian Sherlock stories. They certainly didn't. The plot unfolds in the late 19th century London, yet the screenplay is full of action, motion, and special effects that deliver the pace of the 21st century. Well, the Hollywood version of it. It was a real digression from the canon, and I can't say that I became a real fan of the movie itself. Finally, it somehow reminded me of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Yet the acting of Downey was convincing, and I believed his Sherlock. And yeah, Law's Watson was also a great match.
All mine?
Turns out that I was not alone in that feeling. The picture set several box office records in the United States for a Christmas Day release and earned Downey his second Golden Globe Award. The second film followed this action mystery path, and although some criticized this modern approach to the old-time classics, I guess that's again the acting of Downey that made it quite convincing. Just like Jeremy Brett, he also had experienced that sort of bipolar personality with episodes of hyperactivity followed by the inevitable fallouts.
There's nothing of interest for me out there on Earth at all.
Now there was the crowd favorite, Benedict Cumberbatch, the Sherlock for new generation of viewers, I suppose.
Ignore all of that, it's just the shock talking.
Where are you going?
I just need to talk about the rent.
Yeah, I've still got questions
What
for you.
now? I'm in shock. Look, I've got a blanket.
Sherlock?
I tell you the truth, for many years I resisted and didn't watch a single episode. It wasn't the Sherlock I was rather conservatively thinking of, particularly in terms of look, particularly in terms of present-day setting. What a fool I was, mamma mia! He's great fit for this type of personality, and this time transfer into the present day made it even more enticing.
Is that it?
Is that what?
We only just met. We're going to go look at a flat.
Problem?
Like, really, what's the point in trying to repeat the already iconic portrayals of the past? Why not try to develop some new depths and dimensions of the evergreen character? And what would you say? How did you find Benedict's work?
Oh, I may be on the side of the angels, but don't think for 1 second that I am one of them.
At the same time as BBC's Sherlock, Johnny Lee Miller portrayed the consulting detective in the American CBS series Elementary. It was Miller who stripped Ale Norwood of the title of the actor who had played Holmes more times than anyone else in film or TV, with his 154 episodes. I haven't watched it yet, so here I have to rely on your opinion. Did you enjoy it? Oh, hey!
I'm assuming the evening went well, or you wouldn't have ended it with a goodnight kiss.
There is a female Dr. Watson there, they say, and they moved to Manhattan. Well, I'll try to watch it if you say it's worth it. Meanwhile, I shall put him off the list in this video.
Is it, sir? Is it?
Take it. I have others.
Take it, I can't. I can, but I can't. Perhaps I can.
And last but not least, a cherry on top of this long video is the recent take on the role by the British Henry Cavill. In an unusual plot twist, he plays Sherlock in a supporting role behind his fictional sister Enola. Haven't you seen these movies on Netflix? Well, he is very convincing and lovely as the detective elder brother. Since this is not the proper full-sized role for the canon, I shall also put it off the table for the sake of this rating.
The famous fiddle.
That I do not have two of.
And right, here we go. Who was the best Sherlock out there on screens? You know what? All of them are so different and yet so in line with the demands of their time. So it's really hard to put them on the same scale. Okay, let's make it like that. The special mention goes to William Gillett. He was the first and set the bar high. Almost each and every of his followers has borrowed something from him. The bronze and silver medal will be shared between Robert Downey Jr. and Benedict Cumberbatch. My emotional side picks Downey, bronze medal it be. And the stunning acting nuances by Cumberbatch brought him silver. And yes, the gold medal goes to Jeremy Brett. 30 years has passed and his charisma still mesmerizes me even without those fancy special effects. In the year 1900, as Arthur Conan Doyle returned from South Africa, fate led him to forge a friendship with British journalist and writer Bertram Fletcher Robinson, then a correspondent of the Daily Express. Robinson shared with Doyle several intriguing tales, one of which they decided to develop together. The whole plot was set in the ancestral home of Robinson, Dartmoor, that granite plateau nestled in the southwestern reaches of England within the county of Devonshire. And the story itself was inspired by one of the Norfolk legends involving ghostly hounds. In their conversations, Robinson recalled the countless sightings of a coal-black canine with fiery eyes that haunted Dartmoor. Records said that many people there indeed had seen a coal-black dog with fiery eyes. Denying its existence was like heresy to locals, yet surprisingly, no author had written about it yet. As soon as Robinson discussed the idea with Doyle, they were hooked.
I have here the statement of a certain legend which runs in the Baskerville family.
Baskerville?
So, what was that eerie legend all about? Once upon a time, in the hauntingly beautiful wilderness of Dartmoor, where ancient secrets lurked in every corner, there roamed a spectral phenomenon that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to venture into the desolate moors. The tale of the ghost dogs had been passed down through generations, whispered around the hearts of cozy cottages, and recounted in hushed tones at the local taverns. Legend had it that these spectral hounds were harbingers of doom, appearing only on the darkest and stormiest of nights. Their arrival was said to foretell tragic events or the imminent passing of a soul. This particular notion reminded me of the famous Grim, a giant spectral dog that haunts churchyards and the worst omen of death, according to Harry Potter's divination teacher, Professor Trelawney. Witnesses described the creatures as large, shadowy figures with gleaming eyes that glowed like burning coals in the pitch-black darkness. Some claimed the dogs had hellish, fearsome appearance, while others spoke of them as mournful, soulful beings that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sorrows upon their spectral forms.
Well, this may appeal to your lurid taste in fiction, Watson.
It was believed that encountering one of these ghostly apparitions would bring misfortune upon the unfortunate observer. Tales abounded of travelers who stumbled upon the phantom dogs during their nocturnal journeys across the treacherous moorland. Stricken with terror, they would watch the apparitions draw near, while their ethereal forms seemed to be unaffected by the harsh winds and unforgiving terrain.
Several people have seen a creature upon the moor, a huge creature, ghastly, spectral. I've cross-examined 2 of them, hard-headed countrymen both, and their stories tally.
Witnesses recounted feeling an icy chill in the air as the phantoms passed by, as if the very essence of death itself brushed against their souls.
One companion died that very night of what he saw, and the other twain were broken men for the rest of their days.
As the years passed, superstitions took hold, and the locals truly believed in the power of those ghostly beings. For them it was an undeniable dire omen. Simply put, if you cross paths with this ghostly hound, misfortune is sure to follow. So, even today, when the mist hangs heavy over the moors and the wind whispers ancient secrets, the legend of the ghost dogs lives on. The roots of this tale are deeply intertwined with English folklore and mythology. In fact, it spans way beyond British Isles. Similar spectral tales can be found in various cultures across the world. But in the context of Dartmoor, the legend likely draws inspiration from the combination of historical events, local beliefs, and storytelling traditions. One possible real-life basis for the legend is the presence of large black dogs or black-coated breeds in the region, such as black mastiffs, black sheepdogs, or even large black wolves that might have once roamed the area. Encounters with these animals in the eerie moorland conditions could easily have been misinterpreted or embellished, giving rise to the ghostly dog tales.
Then you yourself are inclining towards a supernatural explanation.
You know, despite being a huge animal lover myself, I'm very much afraid of dogs. But don't tell them, I'm already afraid that they smell my fear. Well, not so long ago, I went for a walk in the picturesque forest path in Andorra. It's a tiny country stuck in the middle of Pyrenees mountains. I went there for short holidays. Anyway, you know what? Lucky me. No, I bumped into a huge white dog, also promenading all alone by itself there. So the moment the dog sees me, It puts on pace and starts sniffing around me in search of some food or I don't know what. I thought probably that's the end. At least I was petrified. Well, long story short, I survived, yet now I'm telling this legend of my meeting with Great White Pyrenees and my magical survival to everyone around, you now including. A real indigenous Pyrenean mountain dog, by the way. So I can easily imagine a horror that a huge black hound may instill in some lonely roamer in foggy moors.
Go back! Go straight to London instantly! For God's sake, do as I ask. Go back and never set foot on the moor again.
Additionally, the legend might have been influenced by ancient Celtic and Anglo-Saxon beliefs in supernatural beings and mythical creatures. The Celts, in particular, had a rich traditions of associating dogs with the other world and the afterlife. They believed that certain dogs served as guardians and guides between the worlds of the living and the dead. This reminds me of Anubis from ancient Egypt religion, a man with a canine head, the god of funerary rites, protector of graves, and guide to the underworld. So you see, the idea of spectral dog being an omen of death or bad luck is also a common theme in various cultures. However, the actual existence of spectral hounds haunting Dartmoor is a matter of folklore and superstitions rather than concrete evidence.
It's a fairy tale, sir.
Well, of course, Mr. Holmes. But fairy tales would not survive without a kernel of truth, huh?
Let's get back to our writer pals, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Bertram Fletcher Robinson. The title of their future opus emerged with a flash of inspiration, and soon Doyle wrote to his mother stating that he and Robinson are going to do a small book together, The Hound of the Baskervilles, a real creeper. Thanks to the suggestion of Robinson, the story was based on a local Dartmoor variation of ghost hound legend centered around the personality of evil 17th century squire Richard Cabell. He eventually became the inspiration for Doyle's character of Jake Stapleton, who hides his vicious dog on the moor. Not surprisingly that when he died, locals were petrified that his spirit would escape and buried him in a coffin sealed with a thick slate lid and enclosed it in a special tomb. Not sure if that actually happened or not, yet the legend goes on and says that the night he was buried, a spectral group of hounds arrived, loudly expressing their sorrow near his burial site. From that moment onward, he would often be seen guiding the ghostly pack across the moor, typically on the anniversary of his passing. When the pack wasn't engaged in hunting, they could be found lingering around his grave, emitting mournful and eerie sounds. In the book, Holmes suspects that Stapleton used phosphorus to give the hound its eerie glow. Curiously, today, tourists often stumble across similarly fluorescent beasts, but way less scary glow-in-the-dark ponies that were painted with reflective paint to make them more visible to drivers overnight. Doyle realized that he had no need to create a protagonist for the tale, as Sherlock Holmes was already at his disposal. Consequently, the remuneration doubled, and Doyle and Robertson divided it in the ratio of 3-to-1. This way, Robinson reportedly received somewhat over £500. Well, if that doesn't impress you much, note that it would be worth over £80,000 or over $100,000 today. After roughly a month, Doyle dispatched the first 2 chapters to the Strand magazine. Then Robinson ventured to Dartmoor, seeking the assistance of a local vicar in gathering pertinent materials.
You'll come yourself?
I have to stay in London. Blackmail case. I recommend my friend Watson.
That's very kind of you, Doctor.
His co-author Doyle soon joined him there. One of the most interesting weeks that I ever spent was with Doyle on Dartmoor, Robinson recalled in 1905. He made the journey in my company shortly after I told him, and he had accepted from me a plot which eventuated in the Hound of the Baskervilles. Dartmoor, the great wilderness of bog and rock that cuts Devonshire at this point, appealed to his imagination. He listened eagerly to my stories of ghost hounds, of the headless riders, and of the devils that lurk in the hollows, legends upon which I have been reared, for my home lay on the borders of the moor. How well he turned to account his impressions will be remembered by all readers of The Hound. This way, The Hound of the Baskervilles was at first conceived as a Victorian ghost story, and then gradually shifted in style and subject to 20th century supernatural horror. Oh yes, I remember being just afraid of the title itself, The Hound of Baskerville, when I was a kid, of course. So yeah, well done, a real creeper it was indeed.
There is a realm in which the most accomplished detective is helpless. There are certain things here which are impossible to reconcile to the settled order of nature.
Yes, well, if you believe this to be supernatural, you'll find more help from a priest.
And do you believe in ghost dogs? Alright, we're at least somewhat afraid of meeting one while reading this famous novel. Share your creepy stories in the comments. Once upon a time, there were two little girls who cold-heartedly made Arthur Conan Doyle believe that there were fairies in 20th century England. This incredible yet totally true story began in 1917 and ended up in 1983. Or did it actually end at all? In this video you will learn about one of the most famous and ridiculous scams of the 20th century, which fooled the celebrated author of Sherlock Holmes, as well as numerous followers of the mystic Madame Blavatsky and crowds of amateur photographers. It all started in the final years of the First World War. A 9-year-old Frances Griffiths returned with her family to England from South Africa, where she's been living for her whole life. Her father was recruited for the front, and Frances, together with her mother, was obviously going through a very stressful period in their lives. The cold and stiff upper-lipped Britain was so different to the country where they used to live. They moved with the family of her mother's sister, who also had a daughter, Elsie. The Wrights were living peacefully in Cuttingley, West Yorkshire. As 16-year-old Elsie grew very fond of her cousin, and the two spent all their time together. They particularly loved to have a walk by the Cottingley Beck, the stream that ran past the foot of their garden, and played there for hours. Once Frances' mother asked how did they spend their time, and was somewhat surprised to hear the answer of her 9-year-old daughter. "We've been playing with fairies." Well, so what? Who would take the words of the small girl seriously? Her mother got mad. She didn't believe the nonsense. Yet the 16-year-old Elsie supported her younger cousin. "Yes, we are playing with fairies there." The adults still didn't believe their brave statements, yet looks like they got intrigued by the extravagance of those fantasies. Elsie's father, Arthur Wright, decided to give them a photo camera so that they could picture their fairy friends and this way prove their words. Amusingly, he only gave them a single photo negative. Obviously, back in the day you couldn't take 4 gigabytes of photos trying to make the best shoot. Surprisingly, an hour later, girls returned home enormously proud. They managed to catch the fairies on camera. Arthur Wright was a keen amateur photographer with his own darkroom and all the equipment required to develop the plate the girls had taken. So, when he performed all the manipulations, everyone saw a perfectly clear image of Frances lying in the grass with small fairies joyfully dancing around her. Come on, really? It looks like some orchestrated ancient Photoshop. That's what the entire family thought of that and kept laughing at them when they tried to talk about their fairy friends. Well, he loves best who loves last. The girls were rather determined. 6 months later, they took the camera once again and now brought back the picture of the elder Elsie, who was sitting on the grass, appearing to engage with some little pixie elf. Does it look more convincing? What would you say? Nobody in the family thought so. This time, Elsie's father got really angry, took away the camera and forbade them from talking about fairies at all. This story might have ended right at that point, yet it turned out that it was only the beginning. 3 years later, girls' mothers, who were sisters if you remember, visited a lecture given by the unfashionable Theosophical Society of England. Briefly, Theosophes were the followers of the legendary Madame Blavatsky, who was the founder of this whole movement of spiritual mysticism. Think of those spiritual seances where everyone sits at a table, their pinkies touching the neighbors, asking questions for the dead and following the movement of the table or some outside noises in order to get the answers. These practices and theoretical studies, whatever that means, flourished at the end of the 19th century and in the first decades of the 20th century, and fascinated people who wanted to believe in magic, supernatural forces, life after death, and so on. Getting back to the girls' mothers, that lecture they popped in was devoted to nothing else but the fairies in our life. Finally, those photographs found the right eyes. Everyone was amazed by the stories mothers told about their daughters' experiments 3 years ago, and the images finally made it to the table of Edward Gardner, the chief secretary of the English Theosophical Society.
Good heavens!
One of the key figures in this spiritualist movement, Gardner didn't have to think twice to happily believe in the authenticity of the photos. Moreover, he apparently thought that they might become a perfect illustration of the key theosophical message, that humankind was undergoing a process of transformation that would lead eventually to the perfection of species. This way, those two images were the perfect supernatural proof that great metaphysical changes were actually happening. Yet, to strengthen the case, Gardner set them for the expertise of the well-known British photographic expert Harold Snelling, who, by mere coincidence, happened to be an avid member of the Mystic Club. His dogmatic statement was straightforward. The two negatives are entirely genuine, unfaced photographs, with no trace whatsoever of studio work involving card or paper models. In other words, no Photoshop, just pure magic. True story.
Mr. Gardner had your photographs tested.
Merely as a precaution, of course. Oh, they're quite real. They're quite extraordinary.
Wait a minute, and what about Arthur Conan Doyle? What does Sherlock's author have to do with this fancy story? Yes, here is the perfect moment to introduce the perhaps most famous believer in this fairy tale.
Francis, Elsie. This is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
How do you do?
Through the course of his long life, Doyle had rather fluid beliefs. He migrated from being Christian to becoming a mystic and never looked back again. No wonder he saw the pictures, and his spirit was ignited by this contemporary evidence of the magical powers. By coincidence, the appearance of the photographs in public happened at the same time when Doyle was working on the Christmas story for the Strand magazine, which, of course, concerned fairies. Well, it is a well-known fact that they were obsessed with fairies in the Victorian and later Edwardian England. So Doyle didn't hesitate to reach for Arthur Wright and ask for permission to use the photographs by his daughter and niece in his article. The Wrights were humbled by this proposal from their favorite writer, who was a star of unbelievable magnitude at the time, and granted him those rights for publication and even didn't take the payment for that. A fan of spirits, Doyle was still a skeptic who always challenged the numerous proofs and evidences of paranormal activities. So, before a publication with his name on it, he decided to once again set the negatives for the expertise, now with the famous Kodak photo company. Wise move, right? Yet imagine Kodak also proved that the negatives weren't altered in any way during the post-production.
Our preliminary findings suggest that the negative plates may indeed be untouched single exposures.
At that point, Arthur Conan Doyle was going to Australia with some lectures on spiritism, of course, and together with Gardner, they decided to ask for more photos from the Cottingley girls. Gardner sent them the latest camera and 24 plates. He was still suspicious, so he decided to put some secret marks on those negatives to track any possible manipulation. Girls didn't mind taking new photos, yet there was a condition. Not a single adult was allowed to be present at the moment, because fairies eventually wouldn't show up in front of one.
Sir Arthur would like you to take some more photographs for him.
Of course. It'll take us a moment to get ready.
So everyone decided to grab some tea and let them go alone. And a few hours later, they were back with 2 new pictures with fairies in it. Gardner was astonished. It turned out they really used those very marked negatives he gave them. Arthur Conan Doyle was also persuaded by all the evidence provided. In December 1920, his article on real-life fairies goes public in the Strand magazine, illustrated by those new pictures by Elsie and Frances. Although they decided to change the names of the girls to keep them from the potentially excessive attention from the public. And what a wise decision that was! The issue was sold out in a matter of days, and everyone was discussing the mysterious creatures with some mixed feelings of awe and cringe. Certainly, many readers couldn't believe their eyes, yet they couldn't resist the authority of their favorite writer. Others went even further and proclaimed the beginning of the new era, where humanity gets ready to face the previously unknown and hidden mysteries of our being.
If these photographs are true, and nothing I have seen this morning persuades me that they are not, then we are facing the single most important discovery of our century.
And yeah, there were voices that were laughing at how easily kids could manipulate and deceive some foolish adults. Arthur Conan Doyle wasn't discouraged by that minority and soon released another article on the subject, and then, in 1922, a whole book, The Coming of Fairies, which brought up even more polarized discussions among the reading public. Well, I guess it is more or less obvious that the photos are staged. Don't they look like that, no? Yet how then did so many adequate, at first sight, people believe them? Actually, Victorian morale looked at children as pure and innocent creatures who can't do any intentional harm and deceive adults. Moreover, there were 2 young girls, and one of them was just 10 years old. Could you imagine that a 10-year-old girl would keep a secret for so long? How naive they were, these Victorians, huh? The 2 little mischiefs kept their mouths shut for 66 years.
What are we going to do? We promised we'd never tell. Never come out now. Never see them again.
Only in 1983 did the elderly Elsie and Frances tell the truth about their prank. No, they didn't plan to deceive the entire mankind. It just sort of went out of control.
Because people often say to me, don't you feel ashamed that you've made all these poor people look fools? They believed in you.
They explained that they were angry at their parents and decided to trick them. The elder Elsie painted out the images of dancing fairies from the children's book, added the wings, painted them over with watercolors, and then they cut out the fingers of the cardboard. It's funny, they failed to properly cut the little fingers, which would later make crowds of Theosophy followers argue on whether fairies have some kind of webs between their fingers.
What we did, and I said, we with the long hat pin, we put it down the back like that, and stuck the tape at the back like that, and then gradually wormed that down. They were longer than that, though. They were or they were about that then.
It wasn't a particularly strong fixation, so the figures were trembling in the wind, which gave that movement feel to the negatives. At first, they simply didn't want to tell the truth to their parents. Then, when so many people have seen the photos and believed in fairies, Elsie and Francis were simply afraid to reveal their joke, since they didn't want to be punished for such a stir that they caused.
We didn't have to tell a lie about it at all, because always somebody came out to justify it.
And when even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle fell victim to their creation, they agreed not to say a word to anyone until his death, for the sake of the crowd's favourite author's reputation.
It was very embarrassing because, I mean, two village kids and a brilliant man like Conan Doyle, well, we could only just keep quiet.
The utmost absurdity of this whole situation is that in his book, The Coming of Fairies, Doyle reflects on the possibility of the photos having been faked. Just like the master of his deductive method, his famous Sherlock Holmes, he agrees that the only way to do that would be to cut the fairies from the cardboard. And now, attention! In his reflections, he reckons that it was by no means possible, since how could some village girls make such beautiful drawings and then cut them out so masterfully?
Clever operator. Good God, gentlemen. The girls are 8 and 12 years old, the children of ordinary working men. What cleverness would you afford them?
Amazing, isn't it? In his eyes, the probability of a 16-year-old girl being able to paint was less than the chance of meeting real fairies in the garden. At this point, I thought that he deserved to be fooled by some village girl. Wouldn't you agree?
Really, Mr. Gardner, what you are asking of Kodak is nothing less than to verify the existence of fairies. Who's next? Father Christmas?
One last thing. Elsie, the younger cousin, kept insisting that apart from making staged photos with cardboard figures, they actually saw fairies by that back. To prove that, she gave the 5th photo, where the semi-translucent fairies were dancing in the grass. She said that they actually never made that photo. Well, the contemporary specialists came to the conclusion that it was probably a result of the double exposition, as they call it. Perhaps one of the girls still made that photo, and then either accidentally took the camera off and made another photo of the grass. That's how the fairies appeared to be mingling in the grass there. And do you believe in fairies? Or perhaps you have seen them, or say some elves or ghosts somewhere? Share your stories in the comments. Who is here after watching the second Enola Holmes movie and searching for some info about those magic girls and their strike? I am.
Perhaps I should explain.
Some of what follows is true, the important parts at least. And yeah, well, Sherlock's younger sister is no less a fantasy than the detective genius of her elder brother. This story about the toxic phosphorus and the historic industrial action taken by women for women is true and extremely fascinating. So that's what actually happened in reality. The movie plot is presumably taking us to London in the late 1880s, where the young and ambitious detective, worthy of the Holmes name, gets involved in a case where strange things happen at the match factory, which employs women workers. Not to drop heavy spoilers here, I'll just say that the case turns out to be more complicated than it seems, and Enola finds herself in the center of the riot for the rights of the female workers, which working and health conditions became heavily dependent on the ingredient they used to make matches of: the white phosphorus. Well, matches are certainly not a 19th century invention. Like many things we use in daily life, their prototypes were invented many centuries ago in China. Yet the process of their manufacturing was industrialized, if I may say so, in the 1830s. The production engineers added highly flammable white phosphorus to the end of the wooden stick. This combination proved to be highly reliable in use and cheap in production, which resulted in the fast commercialization of their production. The workers had a 14-hour working day, during which many of them were actually in charge of making those matches. They took the poplar or pine wood sticks and dip their heads into the toxic white phosphorus mixture. Then they had to dry up, and then the worker would pick them up, put in the matchbox. I'm not good at that. All of that while inhaling the fumes of those dangerous substances. Demand for matches was very high, and this way the matchmaking factory owners were making tons of money in this lucrative business. In contrast, the matchmaking workers themselves had to produce those matches in really poor working conditions for very little pay. They were expected to stand for the whole duration of their shifts, had to eat at their working places, and were allowed only to 2 bathroom breaks according to a schedule. Any digression from that, any talking or even accidental dropping of the matches, and they yelled at you, beat you, and charged you with constant fines. Many of those workers were women and young girls, some as young as 13 years old, who were coming from the first generation of Irish immigrants living in the poor East End neighborhood of London. Indeed, if you would combine poor living and working conditions of the lower classes and their deteriorating health, perhaps you won't be too surprised. Well, it's sadly rather what one might have expected back in those days. And indeed, the factory owners suggested that their health problems could be blamed on typhus or syphilis, in other words, anything but the substances they worked with at the factory. Yet, even in that situation, the scale of the growing health problems led some of them think that there was something going on there, and that the factory was just slowly killing them for the profit of the owners. One of the most dangerous things that happened to workers was called phosyjaw, the prosperous necrosis of the jaw. Think of a kind of cancer that took 3 to 5 years to finally debut its deadly consequences. Starting from a common toothache, in 6 months it completely destroyed the bone structure of the jaws, an extremely painful and at the end deadly condition for the human, especially if the infection would spread to the brain. In fact, they even tried to treat that by removing the lower jaw completely. Just think of the quality of life afterward. In fact, white phosphorus was notorious for being a reliable poison in previous centuries, although not as good for conspirators' purposes. The death cause could be detected post-mortem, since phosphorus has this glow-in-the-dark properties that were easily found in the victim's body. Interestingly, the first officially diagnosed phosyjaw dates back to 1839, and medical research papers on the potentially dangerous effects of phosphorus on the worker's health started circulating in the 1850s, more than 30 years before those series of strikes that slowly and painfully led to the complete ban of white phosphorus substance from the matchmaking production process. The phosyjaw is also connected to a nearly similar story of the radium girls. You may search for those horrifying details online, or let me know if you'd like me to make a video about it. The pivotal Match Girl strike campaign referenced in the Enola movie happened in 1888 at the premises of the Brian and May factory in London. Annie Besant was a working women's rights activist trying to reform these social inequalities. Her character was not mentioned in the movie. Perhaps some bits of her historic role were attributed to Tewkesbury, well, when he became their representative in government relations. Besant became interested in the case and came to the factory to help its workers fight for their rights. As a result of that first attempt, she produced a newspaper article exposing the factory owners to large social attention, which obviously infuriated them. However, they weren't so eager to lose their bloody dividends. As a reaction to that leakage of information, they fired those who, according to their investigation, spoke to Besant, and rest of the workers were forced to sign some statement that stipulated that the newspaper article was false and that they have no complaints to, in reality, appalling working conditions. Just like it was shown in the film, the majority was passive at first and agreed to that under threats of losing their jobs. Yet one of the girls didn't. As a result, she was sacked, yet luckily her co-workers realized the vital importance of her riot, and that's how the famous Match Girls strike began. In Enola, we meet the character of Sarah Chapman, who is shown as the leader of the protest. Indeed, just like her mother and her little sister, she was a factory worker and later became a prominent member of the union and one of the key figures of this match revolution. Yet obviously she wasn't alone. First, the 200 women left their working places and marched on the streets telling the press of their situation and their will to sue the factory owners. Then all 1,400 workers joined their strike. Some of them even spoke at the parliament exposing the extreme poverty of their working classes and their heartless exploitation by the money-hungry factory shareholders. Alas, unlike in the movie, that was just the first step they had to take. That first strike did improve their working conditions. The owners agreed to get rid of those ridiculous fines, allowed them to eat in a separate room, and hired back those who were fired before. Yet that didn't change the whole situation with the deadly phosphorus, which was still used for those matches. Annie Besant continued her campaign, urging to switch to red phosphorus instead of white, since red one was also a very well-known version that was produced out of the heated white one. This additional transformation made it much less harmful for the workers. But why didn't the owners go for the red version right from the beginning? Well, the answer is pretty simple here. The red one was more expensive to make, and the notorious business owners didn't want to cut their margins. All that caused that famous Match Girl strike, which was, as it was said at the end of the movie, the first ever industrial action taken by women for women. It improved their working conditions forever. Well, at least it kickstarted the unionism movement and inspired others to follow them in their noble fight for their own rights. However, in reality, nothing changed overnight. In fact, Brian and May's factory continued to use white phosphorus for another 13 years, despite the ongoing pressure to switch to a safer version. At the same time, the story proves another notion from Enola film, that it only takes one flame to start a fire. Indeed, I was so positively surprised that the screenwriters included such important topics as the fight for women's and every person's rights and working conditions. And are we still exposed to phosphorus today? In fact, we are, yet it is the red phosphorus and is mostly located on the matchbox scratch surface and in really small amounts. But still, don't play with matches.